Essentials Webinar, talking about death won't kill you, conversations about medical assistance and dying and more. Before I begin, I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge the land on which we reside, where McMaster University is located, recognizes and acknowledges that it is on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. My name is Christine Kennedy, and on behalf of McMaster Alumni Engagement and Continuing Education, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today, our facilitators will be, as always, Donna Thomson, and she's being joined by Dr. Kathy Kortes-Miller. Now, before I begin, for those of you who are joining us, thank you. We have, I looked at the registration list, and lots of people who were with us last month on the Andre Picard event have joined us again, so welcome. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. If you would like to make comments, the chat will be open. Now, I know this is a very controversial topic, so I would ask you to be respectful of your comments when you're putting them in the chat. Lots of people have different opinions on what we're going to be discussing, and it can be very emotional. So thank you for joining us, but I do ask that when you put something in the chat, just be mindful of how your words may impact other people. And also saying that, please don't put any personal information because everyone can see this chat. If you have a question that you would like Donna and Kathy to answer, if you could put that into the Q&A, that would be wonderful. We were inundated, as always, with lots of pre-submitted questions, and Donna will take some of those questions and sort of weave those into the conversation today. Now, for those of you who would like closed captioning, there is a closed captioning feature. To activate it, please click on, there is like a button at the bottom of your screen, and then you click on that and it should say like click live transcript, and you'll be able to see the closed captioning. As a reminder, the webinar today is being recorded, so if you need to take off at some point because you have another commitment, don't worry. I will be sending the link with the recording in about a week to 10 days time. And also, Kathy will be mentioning many resources during the talk today. So I will be sending all of those resources in that email too. So you don't have to worry about like, oh, well, what did she say? And where's that link? Don't worry, all of that will be forthcoming as well. So as many of you know, Donna Thomson is our host. She is a caregiver, author, and educator. She is the author of 2 best-selling books on caregiving, including The Unexpected Journey of Caring. Donna also facilitates the free online course for caregiving called Caregiving Essentials, and she is a co-designer and co-instructor of the Family Engagement in Research course, both of which are held at McMaster University. And joining Donna today is Dr. Kathy Kortes-Miller. Kathy is a Master's of Social Work and PhD, and she has a passion for palliative care and improving the end-of-life care for all. She's an associate professor in the School of Social Work and the director of Center for Education and Research on Aging and Health at Lakehead University up in Thunder Bay. Kathy was named the Lakehead University Research Chair on Aging and End of Life and is committed to improving the care provided at the bedside and in the community. She is the author, Talking About Death Won't Kill You, with ECW Press, and the co-host of a new podcast. So those of you who like podcasts, you may want to start listening to this one. Podcast is Disrupting Death, Conversations About Medical Assistance and Dying. When not working, she can be found nagging her lovely young adult children, sounds familiar, winning at a board game against her husband, or walking her best friend, Lucy Maude. Thank you, Kathy and Donna, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you both.
Oh, thank you, Christine. I'm so excited to have you here, Kathy, and to talk about this subject, which is on my mind a lot. And I know that it's on the minds of so many people today, especially because we have a population that is aging. And I think the fact that people are giving and receiving such high levels of care at home these days, that we are, I think, for the first time in history, kind of collectively being pushed to think about death and dying more than we did when we were young boomers, I think everybody's thinking about this now. So I'm very excited to get into a really good conversation. So the first question I want to ask you, Kathy, is how did you become interested in this topic?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Donna. I'm really happy to be here. And I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about dying, death, loss, and grief, and in some ways to really work towards taking death out of the closet and bringing it to something that not only do we normalize the conversations, but we socialize them as well. Because I think that will all help us to engage, to love, and ultimately live life better. So in terms of how I got interested in dying and death was, if I only figured this out later in life upon reflecting what motivated me, because people ask, like, it's a little bit weird that you've had a whole career basically focusing on end of life. There's a handful of us in Canada, I would say for sure, but usually people come to working at end of life as a second later part in their career. And I started way back when at the age of 19, I would say. So for me, it was when I experienced the death of a really close friend of mine just before graduation from high school. I was 17 years old and she died suddenly. She was diagnosed quite quickly with leukemia and died 11 days later. And yeah, thank you. And so that rocked my world at that point. And I didn't realize it until reflecting later, but I was always quite curious. I knew nothing about dying or death. I knew nothing about having conversations. I had never had the opportunity to say goodbye to my friend. I didn't know these kind of things happened. And so subsequently, I would say it's always been of interest to me in terms of thinking about how can we have these conversations in a way that serve us better.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, that's so interesting. And I'm just thinking in my own life, remembering high school, and two people that I knew well died. One from a brain tumor and another from a car accident. And I remember thinking that is just unbelievable. That's not supposed to happen. Yeah, well, that's a fascinating story. And where did that experience lead you in your research? So maybe I'd love to know so that we can position our conversation partly within the research that you've done, that you're doing, that you hope to do.
Sure. Thank you for asking. So as someone who, you heard my introduction, I worked as a social worker clinically for well over a decade on a hospice unit here in Thunder Bay. And I had the privilege of accompanying many people and supporting their friends and their family as they were loving somebody who was facing the end of their lives. And then I moved into more education-based. There's a great quote out there by a fabulous writer, Michael Simpson, who says, I'm going to paraphrase probably a little bit. We don't have any choice if people learn about dying, but we have some choice about how they will learn about dying and death. And to me, I think that was really a big piece of motivation for me to engage in academic education. So I have the privilege of educating the future healthcare providers of tomorrow, but also thinking about what does that look like from a research perspective, and what kind of questions do Canadians have about end of life. So I know today we're going to be talking about medical assistance in dying, and as everyone is probably quite familiar with, it was legalized in 2016. And I live in Thunder Bay in the region of Northwestern Ontario, which is pretty large. It is pretty massive. We have a smallish population, and we tend to be a little bit under-resourced. And I was interested to hear you mentioned Andre Picard having been a previous guest, because I'm a big fan of his work. And I often will say that palliative care in Canada tends to be a postal code lottery. And so my postal code in Northwestern Ontario, while we have some excellent palliative approaches to care being delivered in different settings, it can be a little bit tricky to access, particularly further north and particularly in Indigenous communities. So when MAID was legalized in Canada, I was interested. I'm like, so we sometimes find it hard to access palliative care. What's it going to look like for medical assistance in dying? And what's that going to be looking like for our already under-resourced and overly taxed, I would say, physicians and healthcare providers? So I did a small piece of research focused primarily on Northwestern Ontario and talked to the physicians about their experiences. And what I heard from them was, in addition to their experiences, was a bit of a call to action saying, if you want to understand more about medical assistance in dying, you need to talk to the family and the friends of people who are accessing it, and about what did that look like. So we did that. We did that provincially and had the opportunity during COVID to interview people who'd accompanied someone who used MAID at the end of their lives. And we also did digital stories as a result of that. So we created and co-created 3 to 4, sometimes 5-minute long videos with people who wanted to tell the story of their person who used MAID. Now our research has gotten a little bit bigger, and we're doing some work nationally. We're talking to people who are trying to access medical assistance in dying. Then we're going to do some focus groups, again, with family members and friends of people who've accompanied someone. And we're also going to include healthcare provider perspectives in that. And then the podcast you mentioned is part of that, because when we started to talk about our research results, we heard from people saying, I don't know a whole bunch about medical assistance in dying. And as a Canadian, if I can access it, I need to understand more about that. And so that's how we started our podcast.
So interesting. So let's get into medical assistance in dying. And I'd like to contrast what MAID looks like and even maybe feels like with natural death. So can you describe what you learned and what you observed in, for example, tell us a MAID story, a good one. Like, what is a good MAID death? How does it begin and how does it end?
So many of the stories that I had the privilege of hearing would be what I would call positive deaths experiences for people. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were easy. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody was on board with thinking that medical assistance in dying was the best thing at that time. But generally, people came together because they wanted to be as supportive as they could for the person who was accessing MAID, and that it was pretty clear that that person wanted it for themselves. So when we think about what that could look like, it was obviously somebody who had the capacity to say, this is important to me. I want to have some control and autonomy at the end of my life. And I want to be the person who says, yes, I want to die, and this is when I want to die. So I would say from the individual who is accessing MAID, it's that idea of autonomy, that sense of control, that ability to communicate really clearly to someone and have it heard that this is what they want at the end of their life. We also heard some stories about people who choreographed the end of life really specifically, so that they chose the place where they were going to die. They chose some of the last food and drinks. They thought about who was going to be there, why the time and the date was important to them. They saw what their last images might be. Sometimes people received MAID out on the back porch, overlooking a beautiful setting. Other times people were in bed with the people who were closest to them as they received the medications that ended their lives. So it really depends on the individual, but I think the key thing that we were hearing is that an individual got to make some choices for themselves that were really important to them, and to be able to have an opportunity to say goodbye to those people that they wanted to.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like many people in your experience have thought about having this event, making it sacred almost, and developing some meaningful rites and rituals and objects and people around them, so that it's something that is carefully orchestrated in a thoughtful way. we had so many questions come in. And one of the questions was, in thinking about the sacred nature of dying, including medical assistance in death, because it's a transition like birth, and we talk about the sacredness of birth too. So one of the questions was, in your experience, or as far as you know, what are the religious implications of, say, having a priest at bedside? There were some stories that I have heard where priests have not been prepared to give the last rites in a situation where medical assistance in dying is the choice of the person. So is this something that people should consider as part of their advanced death planning?
Yeah, I like that term about planning for death and thinking about it. So in our research, the majority of people that we heard from did not have strong religious connections in that piece. However, we on Friday are launching a new episode of our podcast where we're talking with Gay Hansen, who is a shamanic practitioner in Northwestern Ontario. And she talks about this ritual and these ceremonies that people can engage in at the end of their lives. And so making that connection. So having said that most people weren't connected with some sort of formalized religion, I would also be really clear that that doesn't mean they're not spiritual beings, right? We understand the difference between spirituality and religiosity. And so some people had some connections. They might still have had passages from the Bible, of a sort of religious document that meant something to them, read at the end of life. I did hear stories of ministers, maybe potentially not Catholic priests, but other leaders within religious communities who would come and provide some of those rituals that really offer people some comfort at the end of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but I kind of guess that it would be a rather individual decision in religious leaders individually, particularly if someone is very well known personally to them. I don't know. That would be another interesting conversation to have on another day with religious leaders about this. Another question that came in was, and this is where I think that there are some resources that you could share around what are the implications of choosing medical assistance in dying that may not be obvious to a person if they know nothing about it. For example, would life insurance policies be invalidated if you choose medical assistance in dying?
So medical assistance in dying is viewed differently than suicide. So in Canada, the majority of life insurance policies will not be invalidated. It does depend on the different insurance policy. So if that is something that is concerning to people, I encourage you to look into that. But for the most part, that is not the case. Medical assistance in dying is considered to be within our healthcare system, a medical procedure. And so when you ask about some of the ramifications, some of the challenges I have seen and heard about are that it's the right of the individual who is choosing MAID to not tell anybody. It can become within the relationship of them and their healthcare provider, similar to if I go and have a colonoscopy, I don't need to tell my family that I'm having that experience. Ideally, someone has to come pick me up at the hospital, of course, but it's that idea that what happens between us and our healthcare providers is a private and confidential act. That does create a fair bit of challenges within our healthcare system. And the majority of the people that we spoke with, people were on side or were informed that maid was going to be the choice of their person. And they had had conversations with that person ahead of time. They knew what was going on. And again, while not everybody agreed, because as you said at the onset of this conversation, or Christine did, that it can be a bit of a controversial subject. And it can be challenging for people to understand what motivates people to want to be able to access MAID.
Yeah. There have been a lot of personal stories of MAID in the press, including ones where someone has not shared this information with their family, and that has been very painful for the family. But I also know personally people within families where an individual has chosen MAID, and there are adult children, and one or more of those adult children is just absolutely shattered by the decision, by the experience, by the loss, which is a particular loss that it's different from other types of loss. And we have no framework to think about that a person would choose to leave like that. So I think the overwhelming feeling that people have shared with me is a sense of abandonment. Is that has your research shown that? I'm interested in just looking at the experience of the family caregiver in medical assistance in dying.
That didn't come out specifically in our research, a feeling of abandonment when somebody has chosen MAID at the end of their lives. I think we are still learning a lot about the grief experience and how it might be unique from somebody who does not hasten death. In some ways, I've actually heard the flip side of that, Donna, that a caregiver felt once they had, had discussions with their person that they seemed to understand about the motivation, that their involvement and their ability to be present, to understand what the motivation was actually a gift to the person who was using MAID, that this was part of their caregiving journey with that person, their caregiving commitment, is that this individual was able to make that decision for themselves. And while the caregiver, and I'm thinking of a couple of stories that I heard, it took them a while to get to that point. It wasn't an easy decision. And they might not still choose MAID for themselves, but they felt that it was important to that person, and they felt a sense of pride and a sense of contentment, having been able to accompany them in a way that provided that opportunity for both of them.
It's so interesting. I'm wondering if you can tell us, because we had so many questions that came in prior to this afternoon, asking about early directives. Can you, particularly in cases of dementia or any disease that involves a cognitive impairment, can you ask for medical assistance in dying for later when you would lack the capacity to request MAID at further on in the disease process? Is that legal currently? And if not, when do you think that it's coming?
So advanced requests, which is the term being used right now around people, exactly as you've said, it most likely is people who understand that they have a dementia diagnosis, or perhaps that is something that they've seen in their family and they're worried that that might happen to them, wanting to be able to put a request in place that says, if this is what I come to, if I'm not able to recognize my people anymore, if I'm not able to do some of my activities of daily living, whatever the criteria might be, that people want to be able to say ahead of time that they will want to be able to access MAID. At this time in Canada, advance requests are not available for people, but there is lots of discussion, as evident by the number of questions that we received in that there is a strong desire for that to be an option for people. And so when we think back to when MAID was first legalized, at the time of the administration of the medication, which is generally how most people receive MAID, the person had to be cognizant at that time and had to be completely capable and to be able to see to the administrating physician or nurse practitioner that at that moment that they were giving consent to have their life ended, to be able to access MAID. And so I did hear stories of people who refused pain medication because they were concerned that the narcotics might lessen their ability to make that decision at the end of life. So people were often in pain, having to make the decision, that last piece of consent, or thinking about it from a different piece of quality of life, that they didn't want to have that final toast, with that great glass of scotch that they had been saving for quite some time because they wanted to be able to make sure that they had capacity. That has changed a little bit, and people can say ahead of time, depending on the situation, but it can't be years in advance. It cannot be an extended period. It cannot be pertaining to a condition that somebody doesn't have. So advance requests are not available at this point, but I suspect that we are going to see some changes.
Mhm.
I just don't know when.
Yeah. So let's think for a second about natural dying. And I think that death and dying and grief, I mean, your whole area of study is something that most people really don't want to think about or talk about. We know from people are beginning to talk about it now. Atul Gawande, thank you for your book, Being Mortal, and other, wonderful books, and your book as well, that say, no, this is something that we should be talking about. I've got so many books on my bookshelf from years ago when I had my babies, what to expect the first year and all this kind of stuff. And we tend not to want to imagine ourselves as mortal beings, but maybe part of that reluctance to discuss these topics is that we associate natural dying with suffering and pain. Another of our webinars, we had Dr. Sammy Winemaker, whom I know you know well, and she is a palliative care physician and author, and she was really debunking that myth. Can you talk about the work that you do that has to do with natural death and contrast it a little bit with MAID?
So it was interesting to hear you talk about the caregiver piece, and how I actually ended up writing a book was because our center here at Lakehead University, we do a great deal of continuing education for healthcare providers. So people like Dr. Sammy Winemaker come and help us do education. And we would be advertising that to the community. And inevitably, our center would take calls from caregivers in the community saying, great that you're offering that for the nurses or the social workers, but I'm the person in the home 95% of the time. So really what you should be doing is educating me. And we got these calls and we felt those hard. That we agree. Unfortunately, we were not funded to be able to do that, but a group of us kind of got together and we would do community-based presentations about what a palliative approach to care and how to access that and what that might bring in terms of people's quality of life until the end of life. And so people would, in the context of being out in community, have the conversations and want to know how to have those conversations with their people in a way that felt good for them. And that seemed more part of life than sitting down and saying, okay, we have to talk about death. And so that's kind of why I wrote the book, was in response to some of that, because those conversations can be tricky. And they need to happen. And they don't just have to be a one-off. It can be conversations that you piece together throughout your life. And so in some ways, I would say the conversations when we talk about what's going to be important to us at the end of life aren't that different between if somebody dies a natural death, so the death is not hastened. And that is key with a palliative approach to care. The big difference is a palliative approach to care does not hasten death or postpone the death either. It allows natural death. Medical assistance in dying is hastened death. It's when an individual recognizes that they are done with living, generally because they have immense suffering as a result of an illness or a condition, and they are requesting to have their life ended with support from the healthcare system. A natural death also generally seems to require support from a healthcare system too, for the person in terms of, how you mentioned, pain and symptom management, but also psychosocial support in terms of care for the family, care for the person as they're engaging throughout what can be, for many people, a very meaningful process around end of life. I think both are different, but they have a lot of similarities.
So interesting. Now, I know that someone in the Q&A was asking, how does one go about accessing information on the process of application? How does that work? What's a resource that Canadians can turn to if they're seeking information about this?
Yeah, I'm going to do a shout out to the fabulous crew at Dying with Dignity Canada. And we've had Helen Long, who's the executive director of Dying with Dignity Canada, as part of our podcast. The resources on that website are huge. And so Christine mentioned she would send something out, and I have put a link to their download in terms of thinking about accessing MAID. But I would say your first stop generally should be with a healthcare provider that you see the most frequent. Hopefully in Canada, that might be a general practitioner or a nurse practitioner that you see on a regular basis. And I would encourage you to let them know that you've got some questions about MAID, that you're thinking about it. And hopefully what that healthcare provider will do will ask you what's going on with you today that is causing you to ask about MAID. And maybe that will go into a conversation about more suffering and what services and supports might be available to you. And maybe that'll hopefully help you to have an opportunity to talk about some of the things that might be a little bit fearful or concerning you about end of life.
Mm-hmm. And as Sammy said in our conversation also, and you know, she's very strong on this on their podcast, The Waiting Room Revolution, and in her new book too, that often people don't know what the end of their disease process involves, and they assume that it's going to be horrible. And she does a lot of educating of her individual palliative care patients around, okay, this is where you are in your disease process. This is what the next 3 months or 3 years are going to look like. I have a crystal ball because I know this disease and the course it will take. So I think training and information are so important. And I'm so glad that Anne in the chat just mentioned that she's just finished the Caregiving Essentials course today here at McMaster Continuing Education, and now feels that she has a deeper knowledge about the topic because of the course. And we can't know what we can't know in caregiving and in dying, because every death, like every birth, is so individual, and every disease and the way that it affects us personally is, of course, so individual. I want to talk just a little bit about the whole idea of planning ahead and having what are the essential conversations? What does an advanced care plan involve? What does it look like? And what are the benefits of going through this process of thinking through what you would want in at the end of your life and what you wouldn't not want?
Yeah. And so in terms of what I think in general Canadians are asking for, and I know having gone back in terms of the polls of what Canadians are asking for, Canadians want true choice at the end of life. They want to know that they could access a palliative approach to care, that they could die where they would want and with the people that they want near them in as pain-free, both emotionally or psychosocially pain-free and physically pain-free and existentially pain-free as possible. Or they want to be able to say at some point that they are done with living and they want to have that as an option as well. So I think true choice is an important conversation to have. And that depends, again, unfortunately, in Canada, where you're living. So advanced care planning looks differently depending on different provinces. And I saw at the onset in chat that there's a couple of people not in Ontario. So I'm going to focus more on the conversations as opposed to what an advanced care plan works, because in Ontario, we have the Substitute Decision Makers Act, which really encourages us, or actually a call to action, that we have important conversations with the people who know us best. And so that could be our spouse, our children, but there is a list of a hierarchy of who makes decisions for us at a time when we're not able to. That's the key point with advanced care planning, is up until a time when we're not able to make decisions, we get to tell people what we want to the best of our ability. And so when we're cognizant, we're the person making those decisions. In terms of those conversations, what they look like, I think there's something we should be having on a regular basis. Not necessarily full on, but we can let people know what's important to us. We can do that by saying, hey, I just watched something on Netflix the other day and somebody died in a lot of pain, and that's something I don't ever want to have. Or I think COVID also stimulated a lot of conversations about what we might think is important to us at the end of life. We saw people who were unable to be with others, to be able to say goodbye because of COVID-19. People were making some pretty difficult choices about where they wanted to be at the end of their lives. And so we've hopefully engaged in some of that conversation. Is it important for you to be at home? And if it is, what's that going to look like? And what's that going to mean to those people who will be your caregivers and your support system at the end of your life? So it's all of those conversations in terms of thinking about place, in terms about thinking about capacity, in terms about thinking about what's really important to you. And I say all the time that these conversations are a process, because who we are and what we think is important to us depends where we're also at in our lives. So the person who I was when my friend died at the age of 17 is very different now, having 2 kids, having had cancer, having had experiences with the healthcare system. How I see things now is quite different.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I'm going through some of this work with my husband right now. We've just redone our wills, and we've had conversations with our kids about things we would want and not want. And I said to our daughter that I believe, things could change, obviously, but I believe I would want a natural death, but I want a designer for my natural death. So like we have a wedding planner, right? We have an interior designer, and I want a great view out my window. I want the people I love most around me. I might want some fairy lights, certain type of music. Like I want somebody to know me and then design this for me to give me the greatest comforts that I could have. But I guess I would want that, thinking about it, whether I accessed medical assistance in dying or died a natural death. But those, like you said, those are the things that are most important to me. I would want all of it. So, I have to say, though, that I'm a parent of a young man of 35 who has severe cerebral palsy, and he's medically complex. And we looked after him in what I would describe as a home ICU for 23 years at home. And now he lives in a medical group home and he has one-to-one nursing 24/7. And I have huge concerns about medical assistance in dying for him because he is so reliant on support to survive that is not his legal right. He does not have a legal right to the support he needs to live a livable life, but he does have the support. He does have the legal right to access medical assistance in dying. And of course, lots of people in the disability movement and lots of disabled people are really concerned about this conundrum that we as Canadians have a right to MAID, but we do, home care and personal support and home nursing and even long-term care is not necessarily a legal right. These are not entitlements.
Yep.
So how do you personally think about this problem?
I really wrestle with it too, Donna. And I think those are the conversations that we should be having as Canadians, and people like you to share those stories, I think are essential. And we did an interview on our podcast with Rose Finley, who is a woman living with a disability, who was quite clear that it was way easier for her to be able to access medical assistance in dying than it was for Ontario disability support payments. And the waiting list or the time length that she experienced was less for MAID than it was for ODSP. That is horrible to hear. I think we need to acknowledge the horror in that. Having spoken with Helen Long from Dying with Dignity Canada, she said something that helped me to think about it a little bit differently, that the challenges that we are facing as a society aren't necessarily a MAID problem, they're societal problems that we all have a responsibility to contribute and improve, not contribute to the problem, but improve, and let politicians, let our healthcare system know that we have values that say people should be able to have true choice at the end of their life. And so it's not that people are accessing MAID because the other options are not available to them. And so while it would be great, I think if people who are supportive of MAID said, this is what we want to make sure that everybody has access to all the things that they need to live well at the end of life, I think that would be a really important move. But the reality is, I think we need to pay attention to food security. We need to pay attention to housing first. We need to do all those kind of things. And of course, to caregivers who are doing the majority of literally the heavy lifting at home for people, and support that so that ultimately there is that true choice for people. I don't know, and I will be completely honest, I don't think that means that we should stop people being able to access MAID, but I don't think we need to think about that as being the option for people. It happens to be one piece of what's available to Canadians at the end of life. We need to make sure that we are front loading all of the other pieces so people live well until the end of their lives.
Yeah, that's harder though in the face of ageism and ableism. Yes. And sometimes I have to admit that I really worry that this is very convenient for governments faced with the costs of baby boomers aging and people living longer with severe disabilities and disease because they're being cared for at home by their families. And we've seen cases of veterans, war veterans who've requested a ramp, being offered MAID. And it does seem to me that there is a financial implication that we need to be wary of. And so I guess the way I personally feel about it is that I wish we had greater safeguards in place for people. I also worry about mental health and opening it up to mental health. But, you know, I think though, I agree with you about framing this as societal challenges, that we need to come together, and maybe we have an opportunity as family caregivers to speak on these issues, to defend the quality of life and the choice of people we love.
Yeah. And like you, Donna, I worry that people will confuse the right to die to be the duty to die.
Yes.
Thinking about the challenges within our system. I, for one, when medical assistance in dying was legalized, was extremely and continue to be concerned as we see changes throughout the years. Absolutely. And I think these are the conversations that we need to be having. I think we need to talk about what's missing that allows people to live well until the end of their lives. We know that there are many gaps in our system. We also know that internationally, people are watching Canada very closely in terms of how we are rolling out medical assistance in dying and what's happening. And I think there are countries who are recognizing that at times we're not doing it very well because we're not having these conversations and thinking about, if this is going to be an option, what areas can we really build on and improve to make sure that there is no confusion between people giving consent because they have access to all the things that would support them to continue living if that is what they wanted.
Yes,
That
exactly.
true choice piece.
Yeah. And I want to just respond to a question in the Q&A, and I know that everyone is reading the chat. There's so much richness in the chat as well. But someone asked again, how do you access MAID in Ontario? And are you saying that the Dying with Dignity.ca website is really the best resource to gather that information?
It is my go-to resource. If you don't have access to a nurse practitioner or a family physician or generalist practitioner that could have the conversation with you. And just to let you know, your healthcare providers have the right to say that they're not the person to have the conversation with about medical assistance with dying with you, but they also have a responsibility to make sure you are connected with someone or a program that will be able to have those conversations with you. So here in Thunder Bay, we have a number that we call within our home and community care for more information. If you're in an institution, there's probably a team of healthcare providers that specialize in having the conversations about MAID available. But if you're looking for a number for more information, Dying with Dignity Canada has those resources on their website. Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. And, you know, I wanted to ask you, Kathy, you must have given so much thought to the kind of death you would want, because you've seen through your research and through your life, this is something you think about constantly. You think about the context of your maybe religious beliefs, your values, the people who love you most, your children, your husband, even your dog.
Yeah.
And so what is it that you imagine for yourself in the best case scenario?
Yeah. Like you, I think about some of those beautiful moments that I would like to have. Some of the things that I like to think that I've said the things to my children and to my husband.
Yeah.
So I don't have a whole ton of unfinished business in that. But if what you're asking, Donna, is do I think I will use MAID at the end of my life, or will I probably die from cancer, which happens to be something I've experienced in the past? I'm going to tell you, I don't know. And I kind of love in some ways that I don't know. I also love that I could have options at the end of my life, that I can think about if for me at that time, that natural death is where it's at. And I think that I have access to the care that's going to allow me to do that, I believe we have the pharmacological pain and symptom management knowledge that I'm sure Dr. Sammy talked to you about that could keep me fundamentally quite comfortable. But I also know that the biggest fear of Canadians is no longer about physical pain, it's about the burden that their dying puts on their family, their friends, their caregivers at the end of life. So I'd want to know what that was like as well at that time. And so for me, it's the continued conversation. It's the paying attention to what's happening around me, but in society, and thinking about what it is that I think I will want and know that there's time and space for that. Because to be honest, what I think I would want now is a little bit different than I thought during the height of COVID, for example, when people couldn't access their person who was dying in an institutional setting because of the requirements. I want to be with my people. I know that. So I would say it depends.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, I really agree with that. Personally too. Yeah, I don't know, but I'm thinking this conversation has helped me personally so much, and I hope it's helped people listening too, to reflect on what is it that is most important to you. And I guess thinking about all of this, for me, saying goodbye is really important. I'll be so mad if I die in a car accident, like I look at the dying process, whatever that looks like,
Yeah.
as an opportunity to make peace with myself and the people I love, and to say goodbye and to tell everybody how much I love them. So maybe that's just a really wonderful place that we can end. And I want to go back to the chat just for a second, just in the last few minutes that we have together. Shannon is sharing a painful experience that I want to share with others if they haven't had a chance to read it. And she says, there's so much ableism in society and in the healthcare system. Speaking as a healthcare provider who had to watch my father die, rather than the system provide him a simple medical procedure in Newfoundland. And she goes on to say, he was denied MAID because he was aphasic, despite being able to communicate. My father had 3 strokes, so I know about that too, and many of us do. Healthcare is definitely not equal across the country. As a gerontological social worker with advocacy skills, it was a complete systemic failure. And this is, this refers to the postcode lottery of healthcare and health, palliative care, access to MAID, access to end-of-life care. Is there one place in Canada that does this best? I guess we should all move there at the end.
I think it depends. Having spoken with Dr. Stephanie Green, who is perhaps one of the leads in medical assistance in dying in our country, hearing what's happening in BC makes me think that that is an excellent province in terms of accessibility around medical assistance in dying. I think they also have strong palliative care programs as well. But I know that there are pockets across our country. And I have heard stories, particularly because working at our center, and we do some work with Indigenous communities, where people have had amazing and meaningful death experiences in far remote northern communities that did not necessarily have access to healthcare. So it's very hard to say if there is a place in our country, I would say, where things are being done differently. It's people making the most of it, but hopefully being grounded and supported by some sort of healthcare and social care system that really cares for people.
Yeah. So maybe, this is a very good reason to have a conversation with your primary care physician, whoever that is, or nurse practitioner, your healthcare provider, and your family, and just say, what are my options where I live? What are the circumstances of if this happened, if that happened, particularly if you have had a prior experience, say with cancer or something like that, where you have some kind of a likelihood where there's such a strong genetic probability that maybe you're going to develop Alzheimer's or Huntington's or something like that, then I think these are all very good reasons to do the preparation along with your taxes, along with your, finding out more about wills, estates, things that are essential in life. This is one of them that many people don't even consider putting on the list of must do. So Shannon, I'm so sorry that happened to your father and your family. And just one other question. If someone runs into a situation like Shannon described, is there a national advocacy group that could intervene on your family's behalf? I mean, the fact that somebody having aphasia astonishes me that people would not take a consent from someone who had alternative ways and means to communicate. My son is non-speaking, and he has lots of different ways that he uses to communicate full sentences. So who would you call if you're not getting the kind of response that you want?
I would call Dying with Dignity Canada. They have a great advocacy group. I suspect Shannon might have tried that. Yes, please, Shannon, I'm seeing in the chat now, continue your advocacy, absolutely, because people need to hear your story and understand what can be done differently to improve the experiences for people who are dying and those who care for them, absolutely. So Dying with Dignity would be a great great group to get behind you. They have all sorts of advocacy efforts going right now around advanced requests, around one of the things we didn't talk about is different institutions based on their own policies, some of which might be religious in nature. I saw the shout out in the chat earlier about needing to recognize that not every Christian or faith-based religion is anti-MAID. Absolutely. And so if I had one final comment is, as Canadians, we need to educate ourselves. We need to participate in conversations like I think we have done today. I'm going to send out a list of resources for you to check out, some books to read, but continue to have those conversations with people, and we'll learn as we go.
Finally, someone, Laura Lee has asked, what can be done if the person who is dying does not accept the situation? And we had that question come in prior to today as well. I mean, I guess, Sammy, I asked this question to Sammy, actually, and she said, sometimes people just will not accept and they will die never having accepted. But somebody in their crew, as she calls it, in your inner circle, somebody has to know what's going on, what the real situation is. Would you agree with that approach?
Oh, totally. And I love when Sammy talks about that and how information can be dispersed, right? And I believe, just as it's the right for somebody to access MAID, it's also right for the person who is dying, who has been diagnosed with a life-limiting illness that perhaps death is coming quicker, to be able to say, no, I don't want to accept it, and I want to live until I die, but not acknowledge that. It's not a good fit for me and how I want to be in the world, but that doesn't mean it's not the right for that person. Unfortunately, and I know Sam would probably agree, that it hurts the crew when people aren't able to have the conversations. But when we talk about this idea of what is a good death, it's the death that the person has that fits with how they've lived their life. And if that person that's what they value. I've seen that happen, and that was a so-called good death for that person. Yeah.
Right. Oh, thank you, Kathy. It's been a wonderful conversation, so rich and so much learning, I think, for me, and I hope for everyone who is listening today. And I'm going to deepen my efforts to do my own end of life planning and prod my husband along with me, and even suggest it to my kids. And, although it hurts my heart, I think that we need to do this with and for my son too, even though he's only 35, but he's been on palliative care since he was 15. And here he is still kicking, still contributing and having a
Still
great
living.
life. So, yeah.
Yes. And Donna, I want to say congratulations to you and your group for having this conversation and having such a large turnout of people who want to have this conversation. And so I encourage people to ask for the conversation when it's not happening in different places, because we need to be talking more about this. So thanks for leading the way, Donna. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for coming and having this conversation today. Over to you, Christine.
Yes, thank you both for tough conversations, but necessary. And I think the more we talk about, death and comfort, the more normative it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you're right, Donna, as you said, I have all of these, same thing, I'm a parent, you have all these books about birth and development, and then there's nothing for end of life. Yeah. Or there is, but it's not as it's not as comfortable to talk about. But it's part of living. So, why are we avoiding it? Anyway, on that note, thank you to you both. I'm just putting in the chat right now our next conversation. Oops, and I just turned off my camera. Sorry, everyone. So we're sort of continuing the conversation on loss and death and grief. So join us next month at noon, where we have Julie Keon, who will be coming. She is an end-of-life doula. I thought that was very interesting because I had it going back to the birthing. I had a doula when I had my first child because I couldn't get a midwife. So I was like, well, I'll get a doula. So I'm thinking if I had a doula in sort of the middle of my life, I'm going to have a doula at the end of my life. I love that. Nice. So we hope you will join us for that. I will be sending out an email with all of the resources and a recording. So thank you. If you couldn't stay, you can still watch that. So thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next month or maybe in the new year when we will be coming out with some more new topics.
Right. Thanks, everyone.